Okay, so part of our readings for this unit, chapter 6 of our global ethics textbook, The Ethics of War. Now, in this one, there are a lot of terms. So part of what I want to talk about today is maybe some, grounding and understanding of those terms. So remember, always read the introduction. So go through the introduction, and it tells you what's at stake, right? And then if you go all the way to the very bottom, make sure you read the conclusion. In fact, where does it start? Here. Sometimes read introduction and conclusion first, gives you a great overview of what's going on. And then you can kind of, go fast forward through the body paragraphs. So what I want to do is just give you a sense of the overview here, what they're arguing and why. And then, of course, some of the background stuff that they expect that you're aware of. So to make a long story short here, what's the point of this article? He's going to unravel the complex mixture of ethical perspectives embedded in the Western tradition of just war. And then when we get into just war theory, he gives us a little bit of background. Basically, here's the shtick, right? When you think of it, and maybe some of you guys out there are veterans and combat veterans or something, and so you might understand, kind of what he's talking about, right? A little bit more viscerally maybe than others. Getting killed and killing people, that's not a good thing, right? So why is it that we have always conducted war on each other? So just in the background, it's almost like sort of a given. What's interesting, war is almost a given. What's interesting is where the just war theory came from, because no one really cared too much until I shouldn't say no one really cared too much. The historical record doesn't show that people were too concerned about justifying war. It's just, you just did it, right? It wasn't until Christianity. So check it out what I have highlighted here. Just war theory has become the accepted term for a body of thinking that originated in Christianity once Christianity had abandoned its original pacifism. For early Christians, it was clear that their New Testament beliefs implied the rejection of all uses of violence. Okay, read this, and it's really kind of cool. Gets into the history, but it's interesting that just war theory kind of came after the first few centuries of Christianity, because Christians, the idea is, when would Jesus start a war, right? The Christian concept, and I'm not pushing religion, it's just so you understand what we're talking about there. Jesus was crucified. So that shows you that, talk about a pacifist, right? The Son of God allowed himself to be crucified. Therefore, the early church was, totally against war and violence at all. However, as the church, became more and more dominant, and so became also enmeshed with politics, states are always at war with each other. So now it's like you've got to justify that war. So you say, well, we don't want to be violent. However, we have to because, bam. Now, the next couple sections deals with justice ad bellum and justice in bello. Same word. Bellum, it's just that it's Latin, right? Latin has masculine, feminine, neuter nouns, and so the last couple letters change. Bella, bellum, belli, that kind of stuff. But it's war. Ad bellum means towards war. Ad means like toward, basically. Toward war. And this one means in bello, means within. So within war. So in other words, this stuff here is the justice of going to war. Like, what is your justification? What are your reasons? And this one is about, while you are engaged in war, what are some just, rules, so to speak? A couple things I wanted to draw your attention to. We're not going to go into every single thing, but check out how, excuse me, I'm kind of sick too. One of the, fringe benefits of online education, I don't need to be, coughing on you in a classroom, and we can still get things done. So justice ad bellum. Check out number one. Just cause. War is permissible only to confront a real and certain danger. That is to protect innocent life, preserve conditions necessary for decent human existence, and secure basic human rights. Ethical reasoning. Blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to read it. But some people are still kind of having a tough time with understanding ethical frameworks and the ethical principles that underlie actions, right? So this is a great exercise, guys, to see that, okay, here's the principle we're talking about, and here's the ethical reasoning. In other words, we're talking ethical reasoning, we're using a framework to justify or to reason through our actions, right? And again, notice here, same thing. The competent authority idea. War must be declared by those with responsibility for public order, not private groups or individuals. Again, I'm not going to read it out. Follow this ethical reasoning. And it sort of showcases and models how you should be thinking about the ethical reasoning of your global issue, right? And so this is just, again, comparative justice, etc. Just great modeling if you're still not really sure. And I know because it's abstract, right? If you're still not 100% sure what we mean by ethical decision making, here's some examples. Anyway, so here's some of the traditional, what are there? 7 ideas that come into when it's just in order to start a war, right? With the reasonings behind. Justice within war, think of like Geneva Convention, that kind of stuff. And there's all these principles. In this one, he doesn't go into the ethical reasoning like he did in the first one. But just check out this word discrimination. You probably think, oh my gosh, it's evil. No, it's not. To discriminate means to be able to judge between two things, right? Obviously, the main way it's used today is when we talk about discrimination in the workplace or something in a bad way, right? Where you discriminate on biased grounds or something like that. As it applies here, it means discriminating between combatant and non-combatant, right? Innocent versus not innocent. So the idea of discrimination in bello in war comes to this kind of concept that while we're fighting, you don't kill civilians. You discriminate civilians from, military targets. Now check this out here towards the bottom. He says, partly for this reason, just war theory cannot act as a straightforward checklist by which one can decide on the legitimacy of a particular war, either before, during, or after the fact. Instead, it provides a set of starting points for thinking through the ethical dilemmas inherent in war. Just war theory requires moral actors to face up to the need to make judgments in contexts in which there are no straightforward rules or procedures. This is what a course like this is trying to get you to understand, right? It's like there are no absolute straightforward if-then scenarios, right, in any of this stuff. And so you have these theories which sound great, right, until you start to apply them in real situations. And so any ethical theory is just that, a theory. It helps us, obviously. It's important. We're not saying that they're arbitrary or should be discounted, but they're starting points, right? Just like in football, or if you've ever done, was it Mike Tyson said something about plans are great until you get the first punch to the face, right? Situations change our plans, or they make our plans impossible to apply. So the rest of this article is based on some of these principles of just war theory that have been around for a long time, and we're obscuring them a little bit. We're saying, okay, we go in with that baseline. However, it's far more complex than that. And so the large part of this article, like all the way down almost, refers to this guy, Walzer. What's his first name? Whatever, you'll read it in there. Who wrote an article in like 1970 something. It's in here somewhere. Here it is. Walzer's Just and Unjust Wars, 1977, led the way in secular discussions of the ethics of war and continues to be a central reference point. Again, now, as a sideline, a lot of these scholarly articles, like that you're reading here in this textbook, they'll take a big name, an important article or an important book in the field, and they'll use that as a reference and then start kind of like reacting to it. So just FYI. So Walther's approach to the ethics of war was contextual. As we go through this, the yellow parts are important logical things. The green parts are terms and stuff like that. So when we're talking about contextual approach, what that means is another way to come at it is what's called casuistry in ethics. And what that means is you look at the cases. So the context of the situation is important in terms of your ethical understanding. So his war is context. In terms of his ad bellum thinking, Walzer follows contractualist liberal arguments in taking individuals as having certain inherent rights and freedoms that cannot be completely traded off in the social contract that founds the state. Notice, you have to understand what contractualist and liberal means, right? Which we might not. Hence, I know this is just a video, right? I can't load this up for you, this article that I've, kind of highlighted up. However, you can pause the video right now and have a look at these little videos. So check it out. There's a really good video on what social contractualism is on YouTube here. And then there's a really good one on what liberalism means. But to make a long story short, these are two political philosophies. If you think of Thomas Jefferson, John Locke, these kind of guys, that put forward the idea that the individual is more important than the state. The state is there to protect and enhance the lives of the citizens. That's, if I could put it in one sentence, that's what that means. But again, if you're unfamiliar, check these out. I know it's going to cost you maybe 10 minutes of your time, but it will be beneficial, trust me. This means that rather than individual and state rights being in tension, as a traditional social contract theory, the two are mutual reinforcing. For Walzer, the primary just cause for war is a defense of the state against aggression. This is important. An attack on the state is simultaneously an attack on the people's right to self-determination. Before the 16th century, 17th century, before the 1600s, most of Europe was under monarchies. And a lot of the wars of monarchy, and there were lots and lots of them, were over stupid little tiffs between princes, sometimes kings, right? Over dumb little things that were not important to the whole nation, but important to the king, right? About prestige and this kind of stuff. What changed with contractualist and liberal political philosophies is that we shouldn't all go to war because the king didn't like the fact that another guy made fun of his shoes or something, right? Because when you go to war, since the state is there for the good of the people needs to be the cause of the war. That's the huge difference that comes with this. The kind of violation individuals' rights, the kind of violation of individual rights he sees as most clearly providing just cause are those in which individual and community are literally conflated. Genocidal attacks that make no distinction between individual and national, ethnic, or cultural identity. This follows from both his contractualism and his commitment to a virtue tradition of ethical thinking, in which moral life, as with thinkers such as MacIntyre, is inherent in shared community and culture. Notice this is ethical reasoning, right? So he's come to this conclusion based on his acceptance of these ethical frameworks, right? So, in other words, because these, A, then B, right? Because I accept this principle, I therefore, think of this action in this way. That's how you use ethical framework. Another quick one here, virtue tradition. He's referring to virtue ethics in theory, virtue theory in ethics, which is an Aristotelian thing. So again, if you want, you can. What's happening? Why is it not going down? Oh, there we go. If you want, you can, cut and paste these in your browser and watch them. Again, it's totally worth it. Another point he's talking about, deontology. Deontology goes back to a guy named Immanuel Kant. And the idea of deontology is basically this. There are universal logical rules that cannot be broken. And that's what ethics is based on. A human being equals X. Therefore, all human beings are X. It's the basis for things like human rights. It doesn't matter, why you want to screw people over. It doesn't matter why you want to kill them. You can't, because they're human and we all have certain rights. Anyways, in the interest of time, folks, I'm going to kind of speed up a little bit because it's kind of a long article, but just kind of follow through. And if you see my highlights, this is where some important. Think about what I've highlighted. Here, a variety of theorists have taken issue with Waltzer's arguments. Like surprise, surprise, right? You'll notice in this course by this time, you've done enough readings to realize that these ethicists are always contradicting each other. Well, not contradicting, disagree, right? And that, again, is the whole point we mean by ethical frameworks. You cannot ever avoid having differences of opinion in ethics, ever, right? The best you can do is come up with a framework or a theory that is palatable enough to most that we can come to a consensus, right? So that's the whole rest of this article is basically all these other people weighing in on this Walzer guy and saying, well, you got to consider this, you got to consider that. From an ethical rationalist perspective, deontological critics have most often been concerned with the way in which his contractualism and contextualism appear to permit an overriding of the infinite moral world of individuals. Where we're going is basically this. Some people will look at Walther. At first, you're like, okay, well, this is great, right? We got to be good people. We got to save ourselves from attack and all that. Right on. But the deontologist would say, yeah, but all human life is valuable. So where do we get to the point where we can say, no, it's okay to kill people in this regard? Because the deontologist says there's never an exception. So that's the starting point for how one ethical framework is at odds with another ethical framework, right? So the deontologists, the ethical framework of deontology, theory and framework I'm using interchangeably at this point, would disagree with the theorists of social contractualism. And this is what he explains. And here's another guy, this Katie, who argues that Walther's ethics of war overemphasizes the ethical worth of states and the principles of sovereignty inherent in the contemporary international system at the expense of individual rights. So there you go, right? It's like, well, who's more important, the individual, right, or the society? Good states and bad states, you got to discriminate between as well, right? So anyway, what we're doing here is we're, discussing and dialoguing different ethical theories and how they can shed light on this situation of when we can go to war. Another one that comes up is utilitarianism. So here's a quick video on utilitarianism. It is yet another ethical theory / framework that comes into play, and it's arguing the greatest good for the greatest many. Some people would say, well, going to war, it's not a great thing, but in the scheme of things, it will provide the greatest happiness for the greatest many. The problem with that is, how do you weigh that off, right? This might mean that in some cases, states had no right to self-defense if their members would actually be better off if the state were invaded, right? So, again, utilitarianism might not be the way to go. Discrimination came up already. I just wanted to make sure that you understood. Again, by discrimination, we don't mean, discriminating against someone racially in the workplace or something. We mean discriminating combatant from non-combatant. In other words, who's a legitimate target? Feminism, another aspect to this. Oh, I don't have to open it. It's already open. Feminist ethics in the 70s and 80s really started to change the way that ethicists think about things. And it's often associated with what's called an ethics of care. But anyway, here's a little video to get some more insight on what feminist ethics means. And then here we talk about feminist philosophers and how they add more complexity. In each of these, there's more complexity, right? So now he's specifically talking about ad bellum post-Cold War. Post-Cold War events have provoked new discussion about two of the traditional ad bellum principles, in particular, just cause and competent authority. In relation to just cause, during the 90s, military intervention did not take place to halt the Rwandan genocide, but it did in Kosovo. What we're after is this. Oh, you know what? This is maybe an important thing. No, we'll get to that in a minute. But Rwanda and Kosovo. So in Rwanda, there was a genocide happening between two tribes of people within basically the state of Rwanda. The Hutus and the Tutsis. I'm sorry, I forgot exactly who it was. But it was a terrible massacre. And I remember I was actually in the army at the time. And they were about to put us on alert because it was thought that Bill Clinton might send the U.S. Army to go in on humanitarian principles, on deontological principles of saving human beings. But we didn't. We ended up not going there. And thousands of people were massacred. However, in Kosovo, right, it was the Croats and the Serbs, we did go in there. So it's like, we start buggering up these ethical, underpinnings and these ethical rules, because why do we apply them in one place and not another? And this is sort of like where we start getting into what's called postmodern thinking. And that's what this whole thing is about. Postmodern thinking basically kind of holds this. And again, folks, here's a cool video to watch on it. But postmodernism says this, all these rules and truths and ethical laws and everything, they're not absolute. They're not universal. They are the product of whoever is most powerful in a society at the time. So they're based on class and demographic, which totally fits with Rwanda versus Kosovo. Kosovo is European. We went there. Rwanda, African, we did not go there. That kind of concept. So Campbell, she draws attention, Orford, she draws attention to how the rhetoric and legal implications of these international discourses and practices replay colonial logics. She points to the way in which the apparent respect for human rights and the idea of humanitarian intervention is contradicted by the increasingly exclusionary politics of affluent states, whose borders are reinforced even as they authorize bombings in far-off places, such as Libya. So the point is, boy, oh boy, aren't we being contradictory when we got razor wire being strung up on the Texas border and National Guards there, right, violently extricating people trying to cross the border, But then when it happens in another country, we're, shaking our fingers at them. That's a postmodernist thing, where the idea is it's not so much about what is right, but it's what's about in the interest of the authority. Then we get into this whole, what's legitimate authority, and that's what we get into here. And one of them, here's an important. Oh wait, what just happened, man? No, I want to go back to the way it was. Okay, there we go. Whoops. Sui generis. Oh, we don't have to open that. It's just a Latin term. It's a philosophical term, which means self-creating. The point is that powerful nation states will sort of create their own authority and then say, as long as there's legitimate authority, we can do it. Oh yeah, by the way, we're the authority. The criticism of that is a very postmodern criticism. And this brings up more problems about things like war on terror. 9/11 and the war on terror raised issues about legitimate authority in a different way. The focus on international terrorism drew attention back to the question of whether non-state actors can ever be seen as having the right to use violence for political ends. So now we're back in this authority thing in terms of, how do you do combatant, non-combatant? The war on terror is what they call an asymmetrical fight. And another thing that I was going to talk about earlier was the way fighting was done. So if you go back to the medieval period and early modern period, armies would meet each other in fields, not in cities. Sometimes the war would get involved in cities, but for the most part, the armies avoided civilian stuff. The war on terrorism is the exact opposite, right? Terrorism is all about killing non-combatants on purpose. So that, complicates things even more. Discussions in Bello. Check this out. From the point of view of humanitarianism in general, if the just cause is to stop the abuse of human rights, it would seem rather contradictory and hypocritical to engage in extensive violations of human rights in the process of this intervention, right? Again, notice the contradictions. Proportionality and discrimination gets even more complex. We now start to throw in drone warfare, other types of warfare that are more specific in some ways, right? So a drone strike is far more precise. It kills far fewer people than actual invasions, right? But still people say, well, the drone strike killed non-combatants. And again, when it comes to utilitarianism and proportionality calculations in the war on terror, when you think about, okay, well, is it for our ultimate good? And you're thinking, what is the greatest happiness? What's the greatest good? How do you calculate or measure it? The war on terror never stops. They're like policing. They're unending, right? We've been in the Middle East now since, 1990 with the first Gulf War. And it's like, when you try to add up in a utilitarian sense, you can't even do the calculation. Cyber warfare, even more complex, because it's not even always the military's doing it, right? And it's affecting civilian populations. So again, there's no line, or the line to discriminate between combatant and non-combatant is very difficult, right? Okay, and then read the conclusion. So anyway, folks, I hope this kind of helps out. Again, I'm not, summarizing the whole reading. You have to go back and do it yourself. I'm after, understand the outline of what's happening, why you're reading this, and then some of these, background concepts here. Where do they go? That have the little videos and stuff. Where are those guys? There we go. So, check those guys out, and I hope this helps to make this more sensical.